She couldn't even get up the cargo net wall. How was she ever a special ops soldier? Laughter echoed across the training yard, but Grace Harlow didn't respond. She merely tightened her sleeve, covering the tattoo that had erased her past. There was no anger in her eyes, only the quiet of someone who had witnessed death without being allowed to tell the story. They called her a failure, a liability, but they didn't know that she had once stopped a global catastrophe on her own, and the only thing left from that past lay just beneath the fabric on her left arm. All right, my dear audience, get ready for the story that will leave you speechless. Take a second to hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always thrilling to see viewers joining us from all around the world. Fort Wilkins is no place for dreams. It is a wearied stretch of land in the heart of Texas, where the relentless sun pours down on the training yard like molten tar. There are no rounds of applause, no ceremonies held here. Only the stomp of boots, the sharp blast of whistles, and stares as cold as steel ready to sort the strong from the weak, the trustworthy from the cast-offs. Sergeant Grace Harlow arrived at Fort Wilkins without fanfare, without a welcoming party. A military truck dropped her off near the south warehouse of the base on a windless morning. She stepped down carrying a battered backpack, wearing a neat uniform, her face revealing nothing but familiar fatigue. She offered no greeting, made no introduction, and waited for no one to ask. She simply began the work, assigned inventorying supplies, inspecting equipment, maintaining training tools. And so she began to draw attention. Not because she did anything wrong, but because she was unlike anyone else. She said nothing of her wartime experiences, drank no morning coffee with others, never joined the afternoon running group. She slipped out of the mess hall before anyone could share her table. When the tech crew laughed loudly after hours, she kept her head down, wiping the old pull-up bars with an oil rag. When others grumbled about superiors, the heat, or married life, she simply nodded once, without a word. Her silence was not shyness, it was honed, a deliberate void, as though every unspoken word had been weighed, sealed, and buried deep below. And people could not stand it. At first came puzzled glances, then curled lips, scornful sneers, half-jokes laced with malice. I hear she was Special Forces once, must stand for especially messed up, or her name shows up nowhere except that Libya fiasco, seems nobody wants to remember she ever existed. Rumors spread fast in an environment where silence was synonymous with guilt, and Grace was impeccably silent. They said she'd abandoned her team during a Libya operation, that she panicked, lost her way, and left at least 3 wounded. No one had proof, but no one needed any. In a community where honor is worn on the sleeve like a badge, Grace bore no badge anyone had seen. She possessed only a steely gaze and rough, grease-stained hands, and that was enough to ostracize her. Hatred never exploded all at once. It seeped in droplets each glance, each whispered word. One day, her ration was set aside with the excuse, running low on meal tickets. Another day, when she suggested a new maintenance routine for the training rigs, her proposal was ignored as if it didn't exist. Once she returned to the barracks to find her bed overturned, sheets and pillowcases smeared with engine oil. No one claimed responsibility. She still said nothing. Her silence infuriated them, for it mirrored their own banality. When they could not force a confession, they labeled her a criminal. When they could not comprehend someone, they made her their collective unease. Grace did not seek approval, nor did she try to make them like her less. She just worked each task executed with care, each label affixed precisely, each metal bar placed exactly where it belonged. She lived as though serving something no one anymore believed to be real. Some said she lived like a shadow, But those who looked closer saw this. She lived like someone upholding an oath never to be spoken. No one knew that at night, in her tiny room devoid of family pictures or books, Grace would sit for hours beside an old steel box, her hand resting on its lid as if, once opened, her entire past would flood back. But she never opened it. Inside lay forbidden things maps, photographs, symbols, unsent letters, and a small cloth-bound notebook. In it only 2 lines written by hand. I may not speak, but I must not forget. At Fort Wilkins they could pretend to forget her. But she could not forget herself. And that silence, thick, heavy, and resolute, made her more frightening than any rumor they'd spun. The equipment inspection took place on an otherwise unremarkable Wednesday morning, one of those days, when time drips like engine oil and everyone just counts down the minutes until they can drift away. Inside warehouse number 3, pulleys and harnesses were laid out on the inspection table, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. One by one, people stepped forward to scan label codes, demonstrate usage, and follow the same archaic procedures that no one truly cared about. Grace Harlow stood in that line, too. No one noticed her until it was time to inspect the tactical gloves. She rolled back her outer sleeve exactly as prescribed, and that was when time itself seemed to pause. Beneath the faded khaki fabric, a tattoo stood out in stark relief, a phoenix, inked in solid black, its sharp lines forming wings and flames but not with graceful curves. Instead, every detail looked machine-drawn, a mesh of symbols interwoven with coordinates, numeric rings, encoded structures. It was not body art, but an identification code. Rookie Ortega was the first to see it. He hesitated, squinting at her forearm. "What's that, Sergeant?" Grace didn't answer. She pulled her sleeve down in one slow, steady motion. But it was too late. Lieutenant Kyle Vaughn, the officer in charge of the inventory team, had already turned around. He wasn't easily distracted. His gaze was sharp, his posture taut like a drawn bow, his hair clipped to SEAL standards, but behind that neatly trimmed exterior lay the instincts of someone who'd survived operations so secret most people had never heard the names. And when his eyes landed on that tattoo, his whole body froze. He'd seen it before, not on any soldier's arm, but on a live briefing screen in a locked conference room at Norfolk headquarters, where every meeting was shielded by dual biometric encryption. He remembered clearly a report on a scrubbed name operation, Black Veil. That mission had been declared a total failure, 6 personnel missing, the existence of a critical intelligence asset never officially acknowledged. And the symbol was exactly the Phoenix grid he was now looking at. It wasn't in any public database. It had appeared only once, flickering on the slide deck in an eyes-only briefing for those cleared to know that the truth had happened, even if it wasn't recorded anywhere. And now, it was here on the arm of the woman everyone wrote off as a failed veteran. No one else in the room noticed the shift, but Kyle Vaughn did. He knew that the moment that tattoo was exposed, nothing would ever be the same. He fought to maintain his composure, but his heart pounded like a war drum. Grace neither glanced at him nor waited for his reaction. She continued the inspection routine as if nothing had happened. Every movement deliberate, precise, only confirmed his suspicion. Only those who'd undergone that level of training moved like that. Training with no official documentation, no medals, no thank you letters. After the inspection, Vaughn stood alone in the equipment records room, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought of his former teammate Sergeant Blake, who once whispered about a mission that can never be acknowledged, saying, "If anyone survives Black Veil, they will never speak." And perhaps that survivor was Grace. Nothing was confirmed. Nothing was certain. But that symbol steel mesh phoenix could not be counterfeit. No outsider could know it. Vaughn realized he stood at a moral crossroads: uphold the silence the system had demanded of him, or dig for the truth regardless of the consequences. And the glance Grace gave him as she left the warehouse, neither frightened nor pleading, merely the steady look of someone who'd kept her oath even to the point of being forgotten. That thought sent a chill down his spine. Not because of the tattoo, but because of the unwavering silence of the woman who bore it. The operation, codenamed Black Veil, never existed in any official records. To the rest of the world, it was merely a shadow erased from the files, wiped from history, as though no one had ever sacrificed, no rescue had ever taken place, and no Grace Harlow had ever existed. But it did happen. Vividly and indelibly in Grace's memory, in the sleep shattered by gunfire echoing through the corridors of recollection she could never lock away. 6 operatives entered the forbidden zone along the Libyan borderline area marked in red on CIA maps, not because of its harsh terrain, but because the politics there were too tangled for open intervention. Their mission: infiltrate an underground facility where a Swiss scientist was being held hostage by insurgents. This man was no ordinary physicist. He possessed the formula for a biological weapon never before tested but lethal enough to turn any town into a mass grave in 3 days. Grace was the deputy commander of the team. They carried no flag, no paperwork, only a one-way encrypted channel and a promise: if you are captured, you do not exist. At first, everything went according to plan. They moved through the desert wasteland like a Martian surface, bypassing checkpoints with instinct and outdated satellite maps. They reached the facility, neutralized 2 guards, and found the scientist in a dimly lit room, nearly unconscious. But it was a trap. A brutal, flawless ambushes, though someone had betrayed their route. The enemy forces didn't rush in en masse. They tightened the noose, methodically. In less than 20 minutes, 3 of her teammates were down. The team leader was shot and lost communication. In the chaos, the GPS signal was jammed, and the comms went dead. Grace had nothing left but instinct and a man who could not walk on his own. She faced a choice: stay and risk waiting for uncertain reinforcements, or attempt the impossible: evacuate him across 3 sectors laden with mines, heat sensors, and enemy reconnaissance teams. She chose the impossible. 3 days, no clean water, no resupply, no time to feel pain, only survival, bound to every shallow breath of the man slung over her back, and every bullet remaining in her rusted magazine. She dragged him through mountain passes, hid in an abandoned cistern, crawled through an enemy encampment at midnight. Once, she held her breath beneath the mummified carcass of a dead goat to evade a drone's infrared scan. Her own blood mixed with the dust, but she did not stop. On the 4th day, she arrived at the alternate extraction Pointa derelict coastal power plant. At first, the recovery team did not recognize her. They assumed she was a deserter. Only when biometrics confirmed her identity and the scientist she carried whispered his name did they realize what had occurred. But that was only the beginning of the end. The man she saved was Project Solaris, a figure whose very identity was classified, even to those who ordered the rescue. His existence, and the knowledge he possessed, had to remain absolutely secret. Which meant anyone who'd seen him had to vanish from the records as well. Grace was not greeted as a hero. No flags, no embraces, no citation of valor. Instead, she was taken to an interrogation room for 11 hours, questioned about her unauthorized decision to defy withdrawal orders, and reprimanded for lack of clear command resulting in friendly casualties. When she was finally released, a report awaited her. Sergeant Harlow, indecisive conduct, leading to severe consequences. Recommended transfer away from frontline duties. No avenue for appeal because the mission itself did not exist in any official file. Her name was scrubbed from operational rosters. Her previous commendations were expunged. She was not dishonorably discharged that would have raised suspicions. Instead, she was appropriately reassigned to Fort Wilkinsa Base, notorious as the dumping ground for those the system no longer knew what to do with. She carried with her unnamed wounds, unacknowledged losses, and a tattooed only remnant of Operation Black Veil. Not for pride, not for remembrance, but as a personal reminder, I did what was right, even if no one allowed it. Dear viewers, take a moment to relax or sip some water, then stay tuned for the rest of this astonishing story. Comment 1 if you find this tale compelling, so we know you're still with us. That night, Vaughn could not sleep. His eyes were glued to the screen of the military-issued laptop, the cold blue light flickering across his tense face. Hours passed as he sifted through internal data gateways, sealed reports, and fragments of access-restricted logsol leading to one phantom, Operation Black Veil. He could not shake the image of Grace and the tattoo on her arm, not just because of the symbol itself, but because of the way she had rolled her sleeve down, neither awkward nor defensive, and yet not proud. Simply the movement of someone long accustomed to living with misunderstanding. In an aged note file labeled Archive Level 6 above even his clearance, Kyle found a leaked excerpt from the tactical map. No team name, no imagery, only GPS coordinates, and a single line in the reconnaissance report, one survivor run identifiable. His heart pounded. He had lost a friend on that mission, Sergeant Blake, his close comrade since their rookie days. At the silent memorial, he was only told that Blake had been left behind because an officer failed to make the right call in time. That officer's name was never spoken, but corridor whispers pointed in one direction. Grace Harlow. Kyle had carried that anger for 3 years, until now. Piece by piece, the scattered fragments formed a new picture not of betrayal, but of a painful choice between survival and doing what was right. Between saving one life at the cost of the team, or accepting loss to preserve something more precious than any individual truth itself. There was no longer any doubt. Grace had been made the scapegoat for a truth the system dared not acknowledge. Kyle knew there was only one person with the authority to confirm this, General MacArthur, who had personally approved Operation Black Veil before retiring to an advisory role. He was one of the few senior officers who had seen the full dossier and signed the no confirmation order should it fail. Kyle sent a classified request not through official channels, but via the private line once used by SEAL Zero. 3 days later, MacArthur arrived at Fort Wilkins. No uniform, no dispatch, no escort. He came exactly at midday break, when Grace was restocking supply crates in warehouse number 4. The room was silent except for the soft clink of metal and the scent of maintenance oil in the air. She did not look up as he entered. Only when he paused less than 2 paces away did she slowly straighten. MacArthur had met hundreds of soldiers, but her gaze silenced him. No fear, no plea, only the endurance of someone who needed no one's belief to keep living. He looked down at her hand. The rubber glove was worn at the cuff. The skin still bore a faint stain of ink. She peeled it off quietly, and then he saw it. The emblem, the black phoenix, the geometric grid, a stain of unacknowledged history. MacArthur said nothing for 10 seconds. He only exhaled, softly. Then he spoke. Level 6, Black Veil? Grace nodded. A nod without seeking permission, without excuse. As if she were merely confirming something she had never forgotten, though the world had tried to erase it. That moment fleeting, yet weighted like a battlefield. No gunfire, no smoke, yet filled with death, loyalty, and betrayal. And in MacArthur's eyes, for the first time in years, there was something lost. He did not apologize. No one needed him to. But he turned away slowly, as though he had just glimpsed a ghost emerging from the shadows and realized he had survived on another's sacrifice. Kyle Vaughn stood at a distance, fists clenched. He no longer saw Grace Harlow as a faded figure among the base's shadows, but as someone who had walked through hell and never spoken of it. It began with a short videounder, a minute, shot hastily on a phone, the image blurred. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the emotion it carried. Grace Harlow stood alone in a corner of the warehouse, her uniform smeared with engine grease, the stain of disgrace spreading like a wordless indictment. A group of young soldiers laughed, pretending to play the failed sergeant as she bent to pick up every piece. No reaction, no flight, only a frozen endurance. The clip was posted by a rookie perhaps with no malice, just looking for a laugh. Instead of laughter, thousands responded with outrage. A former SEAL, Mark Jensen, was the first to reshare the video, adding a short caption, "I recognize that tattoo. I saw it in a briefing I was never allowed to admit took place." Within 48 hours, the military social feed sonce, the source of vicious rumors about Grace A, erupted into a frenzy of truth-seeking. Veterans from Special Ops units, Black Ops CIA programs, even strategic analysis teams at Langley began sending anonymous messages. None revealed their true identities, but all confirmed one thing: Black Veil was real. And Grace had not only survived, she was the sole reason a port city on the Mediterranean coast remained standing. No one dared confirm it, because that would mean admitting the system sacrificed one person to hide its failure, one email read. But she was no failure. She was the shield. Information began to leak not through official files, but in fragments. Doctored satellite images, excised sector maps, strange 2022 logistics orders with no signatures. An investigative journalist, under a pseudonym, compiled it all into a piece titled, "The Woman Who Never Existed, The Truth Behind the Ghost Operation." The article spread like wildfire. Within a week, it drew over 6 million views, hundreds of thousands of shares, and the impossible happened. Congress convened an emergency hearing to examine whether classified records had been manipulated to the detriment of service members. At first, Grace knew nothing. She didn't use social media. She didn't follow the news. She went about her routine working, inventorying, wiping down training rifles as though nothing had changed. Until a young officer-own of those who had once mocked her came to hand her a printed copy. "Sergeant," he said, his hand trembling as he placed the article on her desk. "They're talking about you." She took it, her expression unchanged, though her fingers curled tight around the paper's edge. The entire Fort Wilkins seemed to hold its breath. This was no longer a joke. Now, everyone feared not Grace, but what she represented. The truth they chose not to believe. In a closed-door congressional session, anonymous witnesses testified one after another, mostly behind screens, but their voices carried the weight of those who had been there, who had seen it, who had survived because of one woman labeled incompetent. She extracted the target without reinforcements, without heavy support, without supplies, one voice declared. And the ones who gave the orders left all the burden on her. For the first time in years, moral outrage rippled from the military ranks into the public. No one named Grace outright. Yet everyone knew who they meant. And the name once struck from the record now whispered across the internet: Grace Harlow. Online, Those who had served in silence began posting images of the phoenix tattoo in solidarity. They wrote nothing but a single line: "We remember." Truth needs no drumbeat. It only needs a crack and the light will flood in. Grace refused to return to SOCOM. She did not reclaim her medals or former rank, even though the world stood ready to hail her as a living legend. But glory was never what she sought. Instead, on a frigid morning, she slipped out of Fort Wilkins no farewells. No salutes and drove her weathered sand-colored truck north toward the Bitterroot Mountains, where there is no cell service, no satellite television, only cold trails and rows of silent pines like untouched memories. There, Grace established a center. She never called it a rehabilitation facility. No signboard, no government funding, just a simple wooden lodge that looked from the outside like an old ranger station, with a kitchen, a wood stove, and one large room where people could sit in silence without having to explain anything. The first to arrive was a former intelligence analyst who had vanished after an unacknowledged operation in Venezuela. The second was a drone technician from Afghanistan, presumed to have taken his own life. Gradually, through whispered directions, unnumbered calls, and unsigned letters they came. No one asked how they found the place. No one inquired, "What did you do?" or "Why were you pushed aside?" They merely sat together in silence, sipping tea from chipped porcelain cups, and sometimes rolling up their sleeves to reveal tattoos variants of the steel grid phoenix. Each was unique, yet all bore the same spirit. The last to arrive came one late autumn afternoon. He was from South Sudan, passing 3 checkpoints on a handwritten pass. He carried nothing but a backpack and eyes that had seen too much. He entered without a word. Then he looked at Grace, rolled up his sleeve, and showed her the tattoo crisp, deep, black and sharp as cold steel. She did not need to ask. She simply nodded. A small motion, but in that room it echoed like an oath. Before long, Grace penned a 3-line handwritten letter to Congress, not for her own remembrance, but for those who would come after her. It read, "Some survivors don't need titles. They need a place to continue. If you can't keep them on record, at least keep their respect." A legislative aide leaked the letter, and it spread like wildfire in the dry news cycle. By the time it reached a senator's desk, the story had become political pressure. Then, for the first time in decades, a bill was introduced called the Phoenix Act. The Phoenix Act mandated a review of all military records sealed for political or diplomatic reasons. It called for restoring honor to those erased from history not for wrongdoing, but because the system did not know how to handle inconvenient truths. The bill passed 98-0, no public opposition. Soon after, a bronze plaque quietly appeared at the foot of the Bitterroot. It reads, "This place is for those who paid the price of silence." Grace did not attend the dedication. She was out in the snow with 3 other veterans, repairing a fence hit by the blizzard. But that evening, as fresh snow began to drift across the wooden porch, she stepped outside and walked the perimeter of the center. Darkness lay thick, without a sound. The beam from her small lantern swept across the white snow and reflected on her forearm where the tattoo still stood, vivid and cold as the winter night. She gazed at it for a long moment, not as a keepsake of the past, but as a promise that buried truths can live again, not through medals or reports, but by continuing to exist, continuing to help, continuing to keep that unnamed flame alive in others' hearts. Some scars need not be hidden. They are maps back home. And that night, in the hush of the mountains, every lost soul found its way toward the fire where no one asked, "Who are you?" but simply, "Have you made it through?" Grace Harlow's story is not merely of a forgotten soldier. It reminds us that true courage does not always roar from guns or medals, but sometimes in the silence when you hold fast to your values even as the world turns away. We live in an age where information can be distorted, where truth can be concealed for convenience. Yet it is precisely then that people like Grace Ann, the silent heroes like her, shine like beacons to remind us that some scars are meant to be shown. They are proof, maps for wandering souls to find their way home. If you have ever felt forgotten, misunderstood, or stood alone for doing the right thing, you are not alone. Leave a comment below, share your thoughts, and hit subscribe so you won't miss stories that touch the heart. Because sometimes, one drop of ink can change how the world sees a person.